In a quiet American town, tucked away on the edge of a winding street, stood an old workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and pine. Inside, Thomas, a skilled yet aging carpenter, worked alone, his hands rough and scarred from years of labor. The walls of his shop were lined with unfinished projects, tables missing legs, chairs needing sanding, shelves half-built. Thomas had built a reputation for his craftsmanship, but even more for his fierce independence. He believed that asking for help was a sign of weakness, a belief rooted in the words his father had once drilled into him, "Real men solve their own problems." Those words lingered in his mind like a shadow, guiding every decision he made. One crisp autumn morning, Thomas received a letter from the town's community center. They wanted to place a large order, 10 handcrafted wooden benches for their upcoming anniversary celebration, just 2 weeks away. The order came with a generous payment, enough to sustain Thomas's shop through the winter. Yet as he read the letter, his heart sank. 10 benches, carefully carved and finished, were a massive task for one man, especially in such a short time. Still, pride wouldn't let him refuse. He stared at the wood stacked in the corner, measuring it with tired eyes, convincing himself he could handle it. Night after night, he worked past exhaustion, tools slipping from his fingers, muscles aching, but the piles of wood seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Deep down, Thomas knew the truth: this was more than he could handle alone. But to him, swallowing that pride felt harder than the hardest knot in the toughest piece of oak. So, he pushed forward, trapped in his own stubbornness, unaware of the lesson life was quietly preparing for him. Late at night, the town lay still under a blanket of stars, but Thomas's workshop remained dimly lit, its single bulb casting long, tired shadows on the walls. Inside, Thomas pushed through his weariness, his hands trembling as he worked the rough wood, sweat dripping from his brow. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but still he pressed on, unwilling to let his pride surrender. The tools felt heavier with every passing hour, slipping from his grasp as his muscles ached. The once comforting rhythm of hammering and sanding had turned into a desperate struggle. As he hurried to finish another piece, his chisel slipped, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his hand. He gasped, watching as blood spilled onto the wooden bench. Shocked, he stumbled back, clutching his injury, breath shallow and uneven. He dropped into his old wooden chair, his body sinking under the weight of it all: pain, fatigue, and an overwhelming sense of defeat. The workshop, once filled with the sounds of creation, now sat in heavy silence, broken only by the faint wind outside. Staring at the bleeding wound, Thomas felt something deeper than physical pain. He was cornered by his own stubbornness, trapped in the belief that needing others was weakness. In the quiet, he whispered to himself, his voice trembling, "I can't do this, but who would help a stubborn old man like me?" His words hung in the air, filled with sorrow and regret. For the first time, Thomas felt the crushing loneliness of his choices, realizing he had built more than furniture in his life. He had built walls around himself, shutting out the very help he now desperately needed. The morning sun rose gently over the quiet town, casting soft golden light across the streets. Thomas sat by the window of his workshop, his injured hand wrapped in an old cloth, his heart still heavy from the long, painful night. He stared at the unfinished benches, each one a reminder of his failure, his pride, and his isolation. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he wondered if he had finally reached the limit of what he could endure alone. Just then, a soft knock echoed through the wooden door. Thomas frowned, unsure who would visit so early. Slowly, he opened it, revealing a familiar face: Ben, a teenage boy from town, standing there with a bright, hopeful smile. Ben had once spent many afternoons in Thomas's workshop, learning the basics of woodworking under his quiet guidance. Those memories felt distant to Thomas now. Ben's voice was warm, filled with kindness as he said, "Mr. Thomas, I heard about the benches for the community center." He paused, glancing at the old man's bandaged hand before adding sincerely, "You once helped me. Let me help you now." Thomas's pride bristled instantly, but as he looked into Ben's eyes, he saw nothing but genuine respect and gratitude. There was no judgment, no pity, only a young man offering his time and hands, just as Thomas had once done for him. For a brief moment, Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, wrestling with the walls he had built inside himself. Then, with a heavy sigh and a small, reluctant nod, he stepped aside, allowing Ben in. Though he didn't say a word, a quiet shift had begun. Perhaps asking for help wasn't weakness after all. By midday, the once quiet workshop was alive with sunlight pouring through the windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden walls. Ben wasn't alone. He had returned with several familiar faces from the town, people Thomas had helped over the years in small but meaningful ways. There was Mr. Jenkins, whose broken fence Thomas had fixed for free, Sarah, whose child's favorite wooden toy Thomas had repaired without charging a dime. And others who remembered the quiet carpenter's acts of kindness. Without hesitation, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. Tools clinked, saws buzzed, and laughter filled the air, blending with the scent of fresh-cut wood. The old workshop, once filled with silence and struggle, now overflowed with energy, friendship, and community spirit. Thomas sat back for a moment, watching in disbelief as the benches came together piece by piece, faster than he ever thought possible. What had once seemed like an impossible mountain now looked like a path they could easily walk together. He found himself smiling, an unfamiliar feeling he had long forgotten. As he watched Ben patiently guide younger volunteers, Thomas's heart swelled with something deeper than pride. His eyes welled up, but this time not from pain or frustration, but from a deep, humbling gratitude. With a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered to himself, overwhelmed by the moment, "I thought I had to carry everything alone, but I was never really alone." In that simple realization, Thomas felt something lift inside him, a burden far heavier than wood or tools, finally set down, replaced by something far stronger, the quiet, unbreakable bond of community. The day of the celebration arrived, and the community center was filled with the hum of cheerful conversation and the scent of fresh flowers. The newly built wooden benches, polished and sturdy, lined the hall, each one a symbol of hard work, togetherness, and quiet miracles. Townsfolk admired them, running their hands over the smooth surfaces, unaware of the deeper story behind their creation. Thomas stood near the front, surrounded by familiar faces, Ben, the volunteers, and many others who had offered their hands and hearts to help. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider watching from the shadows. He was right where he belonged. The town mayor called for attention, inviting Thomas to speak. Nervously, Thomas stepped forward, his heart beating heavily in his chest. But as he looked around at the faces smiling back at him, people he had once helped, now standing beside him, he felt a calm, steady warmth settle over him. With a humble smile, he spoke from the heart, his voice strong yet tender. "For years," he began, pausing to steady his emotions, "I thought asking for help was weakness. I thought I had to prove myself by doing everything alone." He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had stood by him. "But I've learned something far greater. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Because no one builds anything great alone, not houses, not benches, not lives." A wave of applause filled the room, not just for his words, but for the quiet courage it took to speak them. Thomas smiled, genuinely, freely, as the weight he had carried for so long finally lifted. Surrounded by friends, laughter, and the warmth of community, his heart felt at peace. He was no longer alone. He never had been.